When Alina Rivera stepped off the bus, the Texas sun hit her face like a spotlight, unforgiving, exposing. She gripped the straps of her backpack tighter, as if anchoring herself in a sea of unknowns. Clear Ridge High stood tall before her, its brick facade and shattering students making her feel small before she'd even crossed the threshold. This wasn't her first new school, not even close. 4 schools in 3 years. Her mother always said they were chasing opportunity, but Alina knew the truth. They were running from something. Maybe from the past, maybe from themselves. She kept her head down, her long, dark hair shielding her face like armor. The goal was simple: blend in, stay quiet, survive. She didn't want friends. She didn't want attention. She just wanted to make it to graduation without leaving another piece of herself behind. But schools like this always had a social ecosystem: predators, followers, and the invisible. And Alina had perfected the art of invisibility. Until today. Because fate, as cruel and ironic as it is, had other plans. And someone at Clear Ridge was about to learn that the quietest girl in the room was never the weakest. The moment Alina stepped inside Clear Ridge High, the chaos swallowed her whole. Lockers slammed, sneakers squeaked across wax tile floors, and waves of laughter bounced off the walls. Students moved like schools of fish, flowing in and out of classrooms with a practiced ease that made Alina feel even more out of place. She glanced down at the crumpled schedule in her hand, eyes scanning for room numbers, but she already knew the drill. Find her locker, survive the day, and pray no one noticed her. Most students didn't. That was the beauty of moving often. People rarely got close enough to remember your name. But just as she rounded the corner toward her locker, fate blindsided her, literally. A sharp shoulder checked her without warning, sending her books flying across the hallway floor. A burst of laughter followed. Some students paused, amused. Most kept walking. No one helped. Alina crouched down, her heart thudding against her ribs, the sting of humiliation climbing up her neck like fire. Well, what do we have here?" The voice was smug, low, and far too amused. She looked up, and there he was, Jackson Holt. He stood with one hand casually resting against a locker, surrounded by a pack of boys in matching varsity jackets. Tall, broad, and maddeningly confident, Jackson oozed the kind of popularity that wasn't earned. It was inherited, like a throne passed down. His icy blue eyes scanned her like she was a glitch in his perfect world. "I don't think I've seen you before," he said with a crooked smirk. Alina said nothing. She picked up her books, brushed past him, and kept walking. But Jackson didn't like being ignored. "Hey, where's your manners?" he called after her. The laughter behind him grew louder. Alina kept her pace steady. She'd seen this kind of guy before. Entitled, cruel, and desperate for attention. The kind who ruled high schools like dictators and fed off the fear of others. Then it happened. A quick tug on her backpack jerked her back just enough to make her stumble. It wasn't hard. It wasn't violent. But it was a message. She stopped, turned around, and for a heartbeat the hallway seemed to go still. Their eyes met, and for a moment Jackson looked intrigued. "You shouldn't have done that," Alina said softly. Jackson blinked. "Excuse me?" She didn't repeat herself. She just stared, unflinching. "You're kind of weird," he said with a chuckle, trying to reclaim the upper hand. Alina turned around again, walking away without another word. But she knew Jackson wasn't finished. People like him never were. By lunchtime, whispers were already making their way through the halls. The new girl had ignored Jackson Holt. The new girl had told him off. Alina sat at the far corner of the cafeteria, alone, her tray untouched. Across the room, Jackson sat surrounded by his fan club, but he wasn't laughing. His eyes kept drifting back to her, narrowed with curiosity, and something else. He didn't know her, and that made her dangerous. The next morning, Alina woke with a knot of tension lodged deep in her chest. She stared at the ceiling for a while, before finally getting out of bed, telling herself that yesterday didn't matter. That maybe, just maybe, Jackson Holt would find someone else to torment. But Clear Ridge High was predictable in its cruelty, and boys like Jackson never let go of a bruise to their ego. She walked through the front entrance, headphones in, hoodie up, her armor for the day. But the stairs told her everything she needed to know. Whispers followed her like a shadow, slipping between lockers and classrooms. At first it was just talk, a sideways glance, a not-so-subtle laugh. But by the time lunch rolled around, the games had begun. Alina stepped into the cafeteria, her tray balanced in her hands, scanning for her quiet corner, until her foot caught on something. It wasn't an accident. She stumbled forward, her tray clattering, but she didn't fall. She caught herself just in time. Laughter erupted behind her. Jackson's sidekick, a guy named Cody, grinned like a child proud of his prank. "Oops, my bad," he said, not bothering to hide the sarcasm. Alina straightened her tray, eyes calm, back straight. She didn't say a word, but that silence, that cool, unbothered reaction, seemed to frustrate them more than any angry outburst could have. "What? No comeback," Cody pressed, smirking. Alina finally turned, meeting his gaze. Her voice, when it came, was soft, controlled. "I just didn't realize cavemen still enrolled in school." The cafeteria erupted. A few students let out a stunned, "Oh," while Cody's grin faltered. Even Jackson, who sat a few tables over, paused mid-bite. She walked past them, sat down, and began eating like nothing had happened. But inside her heart pounded, not from fear, from clarity. This was the moment she knew Jackson wouldn't stop. Not because he hated her, but because he didn't understand her. And boys like him couldn't stand what they didn't understand. After school, the signs were clearer. Her locker had been trashed, books dumped onto the floor, papers ripped, a vulgar message scrawled in marker across the door. A crowd had already gathered, murmuring, watching, waiting for her to break. But Alina didn't break. She knelt calmly, gathered her things, and ignored the whispers. Jackson stood across the hallway, arms folded, watching, waiting. She gave him nothing. No tears, no screams, no victory. That night at home, Alina sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open but untouched. Her older cousin Lucas, a former Marine turned car mechanic, leaned against the counter, sipping coffee and watching her carefully. "They hit your locker today," he said without looking up from his mug. Alina didn't flinch. "Yeah." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "You gonna hit back?" Alina closed her laptop and smiled faintly. "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because Jackson Holt is too busy digging his own grave," she said. "I'm just giving him the shovel." Lucas let out a low chuckle, pride flickering in his eyes. "That's my girl." Alina leaned back in her chair, her expression calm, but beneath it a storm was building. Jackson thought she was just a girl he could push. He had no idea how wrong he was. By Friday, the school had changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the way people looked at Jackson Holt. He still strutted down the halls with his entourage trailing behind him, but their laughter wasn't as loud. Their swagger wasn't as sharp. And when Alina walked past, they didn't snicker. They watched. And that was exactly what she wanted. Jackson didn't understand it yet, but Alina knew his kingdom was starting to crumble. Not because she tore it down, but because he was exposing himself. Every time he pulled one of his pathetic power moves, people took notice. Not just the targets, but the onlookers too. The ones who'd once laughed with him were beginning to shift, uneased by the cracks forming in the crown he wore so proudly. Still, Alina didn't relax. She watched everything. The way Jackson's jokes were starting to fall flat. The way some of his inner circle hesitated before backing his every word. And most importantly, the way his eyes followed her like he was trying to solve a puzzle that refused to play by the rules. By lunch, the tension had thickened like fog. She took her usual seat alone, but this time, there were eyes on her that didn't belong to Jackson or his friends. Curious ones, respectful ones. Some students gave her small nods. Others just stared, as if silently rooting for her to win a fight she hadn't physically stepped into. Jackson couldn't take it anymore. He stood up in the middle of the cafeteria, his chair screeching loudly behind him. His voice rose just enough to demand attention, but not enough to sound unhinged, though the tremor beneath it betrayed his unraveling control. "Hey, Rivera," he called out, smirking like it was just another joke. "Still crying over your locker? Or did your big, bad Marine cousin scare the marker off?" Laughter erupted from a few tables, but not like before. It was forced, uncomfortable. A few students even turned away, pretending not to hear. Alina calmly set down her fork and looked up. "You talk a lot about other people," she said, her voice clear and measured. "But it's funny. You never say anything real about yourself." Jackson blinked, caught off guard. "What's that supposed to mean?" He shot back louder now. She stood slowly, not with drama, but with quiet power. "You hide behind noise, behind your friends, behind your fake charm. But without all of that, who are you, Jackson?" Silence fell over the cafeteria. Jackson's jaw tightened. His smirk vanished. Jackson's jaw tightened. His smirk vanished. The moment he tried to humiliate her in public, she flipped it. She didn't wait for a response. She sat back down and resumed eating as if nothing had happened. But everything had. Jackson stood frozen for a second too long before he turned and walked back to his table. Alone this time. His friends had stopped laughing. One even whispered something and got up to leave. The tide was turning. And Alina didn't need to throw a punch. She just needed to be seen. Lucas picked her up that afternoon in his beat-up truck. He looked at her through the rearview mirror. "You look like someone who just won a war." Alina gave him a quiet smile. "I'm just getting started." Over the weekend, Clear Ridge High buzzed like a beehive cracked open. Screenshots from the cafeteria moment spread like wildfire on social media. A video, grainy but clear enough, captured Alina standing, voice calm as stone, while Jackson Holt fumbled in front of 100 students. The caption underneath was merciless: "Queen checkmates king." By Monday morning, it was no longer a whisper. It was a shift in the very balance of power. Alina could feel it the moment she walked through the school doors. The stares weren't curious anymore. They were impressed. Some students even stepped aside to let her pass, like the hallway itself had changed its allegiance, but she didn't let it get to her head. Jackson, on the other hand, wasn't handling it well. He'd always been the sun around which Clear Ridge revolved. Now he was fading, a dying star trying desperately to reignite. His smile had sharpened into something more dangerous. The jokes had stopped, and the eyes that once followed him now followed her. He didn't want balance. He wanted control. And Alina was in his way. She kept her guard up, watched every move. She could feel the buildup, like static in the air before a storm. It broke during 7th period. She was walking to her locker when she heard the footsteps. Fast, heavy. She turned just as Jackson slammed the door beside her shut, making her flinch. "Think you're clever, huh?" he hissed. The hallway fell silent around them. Teachers were still in class. No one moved. "I never said I was," she replied, her voice steady despite the thundering in her chest. Jackson's jaw clenched. His fists were balled so tightly the veins in his arms stood out. "You think you humiliated me? That this little war you're playing makes you better than me?" "No," Alina said quietly. "I think it shows who you really are." His hand slammed the locker again, harder this time. "You don't know a damn thing about me." "I know enough," she said, stepping just close enough for him to hear. "I know you're scared." He froze. Alina didn't stop. "Not of me, of being irrelevant, of people finally seeing you for what you are without the crowd, the jokes, the noise. You're terrified, Jackson, and that's why you're losing." His eyes flared, but he didn't move, couldn't move, and that's when it happened. A voice rang out. "Yo, Holt!" a student called from down the hall. "Leave her alone, man." Another chimed in, "You've done enough." Jackson turned, caught off guard. 2, then 3, then 5 students stood behind him, watching, not laughing, not scared. Alina didn't need to say another word. She stepped around Jackson, walked to her locker, and began collecting her things. Behind her, Jackson stood frozen, his face pale and drawn. No smirk, no comeback. For the first time in his life, he had no audience. And that was the beginning of the end. The fallout came faster than anyone expected. By Tuesday morning, Jackson Holt's locker was the epicenter of the school's latest explosion. A wall of printed screenshots, dozens of them, had been taped up overnight. Messages, group chats, voice memos. His name was on everyone. His words, typed in casual cruelty, were there for all to see. He hadn't just mocked classmates behind their backs. He'd insulted teachers, made jokes about students with disabilities, thrown out slurs like they were candy. He'd even humiliated his so-called friends, people who had defended him, laughed with him, followed him. Now they stared at the proof of his betrayal with wide eyes and clenched jaws. Alina didn't need to be anywhere near the scene. She arrived 30 minutes later, already knowing what had happened. Lucas had picked her up that morning in silence. The moment she climbed into the passenger seat, he glanced at her sideways. "You do it?" She shrugged. "Let's just say karma had a deadline." He smirked. "Damn. Remind me never to get on your bad side." When she stepped into Clear Ridge, the atmosphere was different. Students huddled in small groups. Phones were out. No one was laughing. And at the far end of the hallway, near the senior lockers, stood Jackson. Alone. He was yanking down the pages as fast as he could, his face pale, his hands shaking. But the damage had already been done. The screenshots were everywhere: Snapchat, Instagram, Discord. The captions were brutal. "Golden boy exposed. This your king. Jackson Holt, last seen losing his crown." As Alina passed by, students moved aside instinctively. Not out of fear, out of respect. She didn't stop at the locker. She didn't need to. But Jackson did. He turned, locking eyes with her, and for the first time there was no smirk, no arrogance. Just rage, raw, unfiltered. "You think this makes you better than me?" he hissed under his breath. Alina tilted her head slightly. "Number, I think this just makes me honest." His jaw tightened. "You did this." "I didn't write those messages, Jackson," she said coolly. "You did. I just made sure people saw the real you." A beat of silence passed. He opened his mouth like he had something to say, but nothing came. No insult, no defense, no witty retort. Just a hollow silence. And in that silence, he knew his kingdom had fallen. As he turned and stormed down the hallway, shoulders hunched, eyes burning, Alina stood still, arms crossed, watching the final scene unfold. No applause, no grand victory dance, just truth and consequences. That afternoon, Lucas pulled up outside school in his rusted pickup. Alina slid into the seat, calm as ever. He looked over at her. "It's done?" She nodded. He finally collapsed under the weight of his own lies. Lucas smiled. "Told you he'd dig his own grave." Alina looked out the window as they drove off, her voice quiet. "I just handed him the shovel." And for the first time since she arrived at Clear Ridge High, the war was over, and she had never raised a fist. The next morning, Clear Ridge High felt different. Not louder, not quieter, just clearer, like a storm had passed, leaving behind fresh air and a campus unsure what came next. The tension that once choked the halls had lifted, and where there was once fear, there was now space for curiosity, for change. Alina Rivera walked in not like a victor, but like someone finally unburdened. Her steps were no heavier than before, but they carried purpose. The stairs hadn't stopped, but they were different now, curious, even respectful. She wasn't invisible anymore, and for the first time in years, she was okay with that. Her locker was clean, books stacked neatly, not a scratch on the metal. Someone had even taped a sticky note to the door. "Thank you." She didn't know who it was from. She didn't need to. As she grabbed her books, a quiet voice pulled her attention. "Hey, Alina." She turned. It was a sophomore, short, timid, her backpack nearly swallowing her. She looked like Alina had once felt, cautious, out of place, quietly calculating the safest way to exist. I just wanted to say, what you did with Jackson," the girl trailed off, swallowing hard. "That was brave." Alina gave a small, reassuring smile. "It was necessary." The girl nodded quickly, like she'd been holding in the courage just to say it. He made fun of my stutter in gym. No one ever said anything." Alina's expression softened. "People like him rely on silence," she said gently. "Break the silence. You break their power." The girl's shoulders relaxed just a little, like she had been given permission to take up space for the first time. "Thanks," she whispered before hurrying off, cheeks flushed. Alina watched her go, something warm flickering behind her ribs. This, this was what the fight had been for. At lunch, she no longer sat alone, not surrounded, not flooded by fake attention, but joined by a few familiar faces. Students she'd noticed from afar, the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones who had been watching, waiting to see if someone, anyone, would stand up to the king and live to tell the tale. Jackson didn't show his face in the cafeteria that day, or the next. Rumor had it he'd been suspended indefinitely after the screenshots were verified. Some said he might not come back at all, but Alina didn't care for the gossip. She didn't need revenge. She had never wanted to destroy anyone, just survive. And in surviving, she'd built something stronger than fear. That afternoon, Lucas was waiting as usual, but instead of hopping in immediately, Alina paused. She turned back toward the building, the glass doors reflecting the place that had once felt like a battlefield. Now it felt like a beginning. Lucas watched her with a raised brow. "You good?" Alina nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." She slid into the passenger seat, dropped her bag at her feet, and for the first time, smiled like she truly meant it. The war was over, but what came next? That was entirely up to her. By the end of the week, the whispers had turned into conversations. Real ones. Not about Jackson Holt. Not anymore. His name had faded into the static of past mistakes. The students of Clear Ridge High had already moved on, not because they forgot, but because the space he once occupied was being filled with something new, something better. And at the center of that shift stood Alina Rivera, not standing on a pedestal, not crowned, just present. More and more, students began to approach her, not to worship, not to gossip, but to speak, to share. A freshman boy with anxiety, a girl who'd been quietly bullied by her own friend group, a closeted athlete who hadn't dared speak a word of truth until now. One by one they came, not for advice, but for understanding. Alina listened. She didn't give speeches. She didn't pretend to have answers. She just gave them what no one had given her when she first walked into Clear Ridge, a place to be seen. That Monday, she found herself in the counselor's office, but not as a patient. "I'm not here to report anyone," she told Mrs. Klein, the school's student wellness coordinator. "I want to start something, a space, not for victims, not for venting, just a room where people can talk and know they're not alone." Mrs. Klein looked up from her notepad, intrigued. "You mean like a support circle?" Alina shook her head. "Number something real, something peer-led, not a lecture. A space where we decide the rules together, where we talk about what no one else talks about." Mrs. Klein leaned back, eyes narrowing in thoughtful admiration. "That's bold." Alina met her gaze. So was surviving here. The next day, the announcement went out. Open forum, room 208, Wednesdays after school. No teachers, no judgment, just truth. Alina didn't expect many to show, but on the first afternoon the desks were full. A few students even stood in the back. No one spoke at first, but they stayed, and that meant everything. By the second week, the stories started coming out, quietly, carefully. By the third, it became a movement. Clear Ridge was changing, not because of punishment or policy, but because one girl had refused to be broken and made space for others to heal. Alina didn't sit at the head of the circle. She sat with them, side by side. Sometimes she spoke, sometimes she didn't. Her power didn't come from being the loudest. It came from never looking away. That afternoon, Lucas picked her up from school like always. The sun was low, painting the sky in strokes of lavender and fire. He looked over at her. "You did something today, didn't you?" Alina grinned, just slightly. "Maybe." "You're not just surviving anymore," he said, voice low. She leaned her head against the window, watching the world blur past. "No," she whispered. "I'm building something." And somewhere in that golden haze of late afternoon light, Alina Rivera finally knew. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. 3 months later, Clear Ridge High didn't just look different. It felt different. It wasn't perfect. Kids still whispered. Cliques still existed. Cruelty hadn't vanished. But something far more powerful had taken root in its place. Awareness. Students had begun to pause before they spoke, think before they laughed. And somewhere in that pause, a little more kindness slipped through. Room 208, the once empty classroom tucked behind the east wing, had become a symbol, a space no one dared mock anymore. Every Wednesday, the desks filled. Some kids talked, some cried, others just sat in silence, grateful not to be invisible for once in their lives. And in the middle of it all, never demanding attention, never raising her voice, sat Alina Rivera. There were no titles, no formal leadership, but everyone knew it had started with her. One afternoon, as she was organizing chairs after the form ended, a teacher stood in the doorway watching her. Mr. Dorsey, the English lit guy. Alina didn't know him well, but she recognized the look in his eyes, the quiet respect of someone who'd seen change up close. "You know," he said, "I've been here 10 years. Never thought a student would teach the school how to listen." Alina didn't look up. She just smiled as she finished stacking a final chair. "I didn't teach anyone," she said. "I just gave them permission." He nodded, lingered a moment, then walked away. Later that week, the school board reached out. They'd heard about the ripple effects. Discipline cases down, student participation up. They wanted Alina to speak at the district's annual leadership conference. At first, she hesitated. She wasn't a public speaker. She was the quiet girl. But Lucas had said something the night she told him. "You think people follow loud voices, Alina. But real leadership, that's when people listen after you've left the room." So she said yes. The night of the conference, she stood in front of a crowd of principals, educators, and student leaders from across the district. Her palms were sweaty, her heart raced, but when she opened her mouth, her voice was clear. "I didn't come here to be brave," she said. "I came here to survive. But somewhere along the way, I realized that surviving wasn't enough. I didn't want to walk out of high school just breathing. I wanted to matter." The room fell silent. So I told the truth. I faced someone no one else would. So I told the truth. I faced someone no one else would. And I didn't do it with fists. I did it with silence, with patience, with presence, and that changed everything. When she stepped off the stage, the applause didn't feel like a reward. It felt like recognition. Back at school, a freshman girl she'd never met approached her near the lockers. "Hey, I'm new. Don't know where anything is." Alina didn't hesitate. She smiled, adjusted her backpack, and said, "Come on, I'll show you." That was the thing about power. It wasn't about control. It was about what you did once you had it. And Alina Rivera, she used hers to make sure no one else ever had to walk these halls alone again. It was the last day of school. The sun hung low over Clear Ridge High, casting long, golden shadows across the courtyard. Students spilled from the building in waves, laughing, hugging, snapping photos, celebrating another year survived, another chapter closed. Alina Rivera stood by the lockers one final time, running her fingers gently across the faded sticky note that still clung to the metal. "Thank you." It was weathered now, the ink a little smudged, but she'd never taken it down. It reminded her where this all started. Behind her, someone called her name. She turned to find that same freshman girl she'd guided months ago, now smiling, surrounded by new friends, more confident, more grounded. The girl waved, then melted back into the crowd. Alina smiled, not because she was proud of herself, but because someone else had stayed. She walked slowly through the front doors one last time, the hallway empty now, echoes of the past trailing behind her. Jackson Holt's name hadn't been mentioned in weeks, not out of fear, just irrelevance. The story had moved on. The power had changed hands, and no one had noticed, because that's how real change happens. Lucas was waiting in the parking lot, engine running, windows down. "You ready?" he asked. Alina slid into the seat, watching the school shrink behind them. "Yeah," she said quietly, "but I'm not done." Lucas smirked. "Didn't think so." As they drove off, the wind played with her hair, the future wide open before her. And for the first time, she wasn't running from anything. She was running towards something. Because Alina Rivera hadn't just survived Clear Ridge High. She'd rewritten what it meant to be strong. And this was only the beginning. Life lesson from Alina Rivera's story. You don't have to be the loudest voice in the room to create change. Alina didn't fight with fists or try to become someone she wasn't. She stayed true to herself, quiet, observant, steady, and used her strength in ways most people overlook, through patience, resilience, and the courage to speak up when it mattered most. Her journey teaches us that real power doesn't come from controlling others. It comes from knowing who you are and refusing to let the world define your worth. It shows us that silence can be strength, kindness can be defiance, and that leadership can come from the most unexpected places. So if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or like you didn't belong, remember Alina. She didn't wait for permission to matter. She chose it. And in doing so, she gave others the courage to do the same.